Good afternoon, my name is Aidan Seery and I am from the Irish Federation of University Teachers. I sit on the National Executive of IFUT and I'm an active member of the Trinity College branch of IFUT. I'd like first of all just to thank the organisers here for the opportunity to say a few words today. I'm delighted to do so. I am going to first of all, not fight with the technology and simply try to convey my message, a short message, in the traditional manner without slides. So we'll try that for a change. Just by way of introduction, over lunch just now, we were talking about education and the power of education, and I was relating, and if I might indulge myself just for a couple of minutes, I am the product of free education, probably the first generation that was to profit from free second level education, and I was relating the personal anecdote that my grandparents were, my grandfather on the paternal side was an occasional dock worker in the northeast of England, and his wife was a kitchen maid in a hotel. My father went on and was pushed by his parents to take up an apprenticeship, and he in his turn increased the quality of his life. I am the firstborn in my family and the only one to go to a university, and am now employed and a lecturer academic at Trinity College, Dublin. In the space of a short time, free education has transformed my own family, and that I think is worth keeping in the background when I say a few words about TTIP and education. One, I think, of the most alarming aspects of the TTIP in its nature and in its negotiations is the possible, perhaps even probable, inclusion of education in the trade deal. And in particular, I'm going to say something about the entrance, the probable entrance of a large number of for-profit providers in the so-called education services. We could discuss whether it's a service or not at some other time. First, of course, there are already commercial providers of education in the higher, further adult education areas and in the training sector. So in a sense, for some of us, it has already happened. However, there's something new here. Some of the proposals, inasmuch, and we've heard that this morning, inasmuch as we can and do know of them, but perhaps even certain omissions and lack of definitional clarity already to be seen, mean that no sector of education can be excluded from the possible consequences of TTIP. So what are the kinds of problems that can be expected? As with other services covered by the agreement, the key issue for education is the way in which TTIP removes the power of regulation from democratically elected bodies. A liberalisation of the rules governing access to markets in educational provision could restrict the ability of EU states to determine entry and to regulate the quality and the governance, at a very low level, of private and for-profit schools, or colleges, or other institutions. For instance, any measure adopted by a government or ministry to set even educational quality standards could be interpreted as, quote, a disguised barrier to trade, unquote, or, quote, more trade burdensome than necessary, unquote. Already some of the problems can be anticipated, I think. In the US, where there is already a liberalization of the provision of education and a very large proprietary and for-profit education sector, there is clear evidence of alarming tendencies in for-profit education. For instance, poor academic standards, diminishing quality in teaching and learning, high dropout rates, for instance, in many of these for-profit, these private higher education institutions, there are dropout rates of up to 64%. Interesting, I think, as well, there's evidence of poor post-education employment rates, with some evidence that graduates of these colleges earning on average less than school leavers or high school graduates, and of course high costs involved with them. For instance, what's known as an associate degree, which would be kind of diploma level for us, so I imagine level 5 or level 6 programs at a for-profit college costs at least 4 times as much as comparable programs at a public community college. This last point, of course, on the matter of cost has enormous consequences for equity and access to education. A 2012 report by the US Senate's Health, Education, Labour and Pensions Committee showed that on average for-profit education institutes spend only 17.7% of their revenue on teaching and learning, but 22.4% goes on marketing and recruiting, and 20% goes on profit distribution. It also showed that huge amounts of taxpayer money went on financing these institutions. For instance, last year it was $36 billion. Disturbingly, I think the path to the inclusion of education in the trade deal is remarkably, I think, already being smoothed even by the European Commission itself. A clear example is the case taken by the Commission against the Slovenian piece of higher education legislation in 2012. The Slovenian law decreed that transnational higher education institutions had to go through national accreditation and registration procedures. Imagine that. And they had to do this before they could operate in Slovenia. The European Commission opened an infringement procedure against the law, arguing that it was, quote, incompatible with freedom of establishment and freedom to provide services, unquote. That's guaranteed by the EU's own Services Directive. This move is alarming as it seems to disregard the provisions of the Services Directive itself that explicitly exclude education as, quote, a service of general interest and special meaning. I'll come back to that briefly. It is also in conflict with a number of EU treaties which have repeatedly made clear that the content of teaching and the organisation of educational systems belongs strictly to the jurisdiction of member states. So where's the problem with that? To date, yes, there are proposals in the TTIP negotiations to exclude certain services from the provisions of the deal and reassurances have been given that public education would not be part of the deal. But here's the crux. The definitions of a service of general interest and a service of general economic interest are not precise enough to avoid overlap, and they are open to conflicting interpretations. What could happen is we fall into a situation without anybody even intending it, simply because of the way this is phrased. For instance, and this should alarm, I hope, the definition of services provided on a non-commercial basis and not in competition with other suppliers is the definition of a service of general interest. But this may not apply to schools who even charge for school books. The minute you start charging for books or asking parents to pay some contribution, you may not fall under that definition of a service of general interest and special meaning, and you could be a service of general economic interest. So even unwittingly, the exclusion clauses, any exclusion clauses in TTIP may not protect education, even primary and post-primary education, from capture within its remit. In addition to the problematic nature of definitions and the scope for challenge, two further aspects of the current proposals could, again, perhaps unwittingly, and I don't mean to disrespect the European commissioners and people in Europe who may well be well intended, they could bring education under the umbrella of TTIP. The first is the negative list approach to commitments, which means that all measures and regulations are covered unless they are specifically excluded. And this, interestingly, it didn't come up this morning, is different from GATS and is one of the ratcheting up of the TTIP negotiations. And the second is the adoption of what's known as a ratchet clause, which would mean that if a government were, let's say, to experiment with a partial liberation of some of its education sector, future governments could not undo these experiments and reclaim them. We heard a bit about that. You couldn't renationalise it, even if they were shown to be failing in all academic aspects, without paying perhaps considerable compensation to any provider that would be affected by that change, by the reversal. Finally, and this pertains more generally and not just to education, the proposal to establish the Transatlantic Regulatory Cooperation Council, the TTRC, and the ISDSs that we've heard about, to adjudicate alone on regulatory disputes, places the regulation of regulation outside the remit of democratically elected governments and is simply unacceptable as such. National laws and regulations to protect workers, consumers, small business and the environment, to name just a few, they exist because markets do not produce these outcomes. The argument that the European Trade Union Committee for Education, ETUC, and Education International is and always has been that education is a human right and a public good all the way through, and that it is the responsibility of elected governments to provide free, quality education for all. This claim is challenged and its underlying ideas are threatened already in many areas of education. The TTIP, despite all reassurances, remains and is a threat to publicly funded, nationally sovereign education provision unless it is clearly and specifically excluded in the text of any agreement, and that's the very minimum that we should demand. Thank you.